Welcome, and thank you so much for joining another edition of Pharmacist Support's A Dose of Wellbeing podcast. Today I'm your host, Danielle Hunt. I'm the Chief Executive at Pharmacist Support. Today is a special episode linked to Stress Awareness Month. We are joined by our Senior Wellbeing Development Manager, Melissa, to talk about the important topic of workplace stress. We'll be looking at how we define stress and burnout, and most importantly, what we and pharmacy employers and leaders can do about stress and burnout. So welcome, Melissa.
Thanks.
So stress, it's such a commonly used word, isn't it? But perhaps we don't often think about what it actually means. So can we just start by exploring what stress is?
Yeah, so stress, you know, we use one word, stress, but there are actually so many different variances to stress. So when we feel a little bit of pressure to do something, that might cause a little bit of stress. And that can actually be really good for getting us to actually do something rather than sit on our phone scrolling for 2 hours. We might think, oh, I've got some time pressure and I need to actually do something here. That can be really healthy. Then we've got stress that is prolonged, relentless. Maybe you're dealing with an illness of a loved one, an illness of yourself. This kind of prolonged and intense stress can be very damaging to the body. We've got acute stresses. So, for example, you're, crossing the road and a car comes out of nowhere and you have to jump out of the way. That can cause a major spike of stress and all the physiological responses that go along with that. So really stress is many different things. But the one that I would probably be the most concerned about, I suppose there are two. One would be the prolonged exposure to stress that just you don't come down from. That can be quite destructive to both our mental health and our physical health. There are a lot of physical health consequences to being in a stress state for a long period of time. And then there's like a traumatic reaction to an acute stress. So say you were in a car accident and rather than your stress levels coming back down and you kind of manage them and you're coming back to a place of homeostasis, but for some people, when they go through an acute trauma, they might start getting flashbacks. They might have stress responses that keep getting triggered. That might be a PTSD, a post-traumatic stress disorder. So those are the ones where people probably need some support. Whereas the smaller stresses that we go through every day that help us to get things done, that can actually be kind of a healthy thing.
And I suppose because there's different types of stress, and particularly the prolonged stress, I'm guessing, if you're head down and you're just ploughing on with work and it feels quite normalised, we might not even recognise that we're experiencing stress. So what are some of the key signs of stress that our listeners can maybe look out for? Yeah,
that's a great question. So I think you're looking for changes. So if you are feeling anxious, overwhelmed, out of control, unable to cope, those are signs that you need to get some help or change something in your life. If you have constant worry, so if you're going to bed worried, you're waking up worried, you might be waking up in the night feeling worried, that's something you might be concerned about and getting help for. If you are irritable, so if you're usually quite a relaxed person and you find yourself snapping at people a lot more, that can be a sign of stress. If your relationships are being affected, that's a time to maybe look for some support or make some changes. There can be physical symptoms as well. Headaches, sleep disturbances, could be excessive sweating that you don't normally do, abdominal pain, muscle tension, racing heart. There are a lot of different physical symptoms as well. And I think with the physical symptoms, the question is, is your body able to go back into a relaxed state? So those physiological responses are there for a reason. You know, if a car is about to hit you, you need your body to do that so it can propel you out of the way. That's really important. That's evolutionary. It's been there for a long time. If you're constantly being triggered by things that cause that extreme stress response where it's not necessary. So for example, you get an email from your boss and you go into that fight flight state that's meant to protect you from a physical harm, but there's nothing you physically need to get away from. That's kind of confusing to the body. So at that point, you can actually benefit from doing something like running to kind of discharge the physical cascade of events that's going on in your body. That can help your physiology to realize, okay, that stressor has passed and I can come down now. So sometimes in modern life, if we're being triggered by, say, for example, that email, we have that massive stress response. We don't do anything with it. So it never gets discharged. Whereas if you're jumping out of the way of a car, there's something physical you're doing. You know, if you're running away from a tiger or whatever, you're doing something physical with it. So sometimes we need to do something physical to like discharge that stress. So that's why exercise can be so good when you're stressed out. You get that run in or you do something that discharges that physical energy that can be really helpful. So the last thing is, changes in appetite, using alcohol or substances more. All of those things can be signs that you need some help or to make a change in your life.
That's so interesting. And you just think about that from a workplace perspective. You know, if you've had a really stressful day and it's built and then you go home and there's stressful things to deal with, I've never really thought about the fact that you're not discharging that. So obviously it's going to build and we know that in pharmacy, there are, you know, it can be a very stressful place to work and we've got a lot of data on that. What data is there out there, particularly on kind of stress and the profession and what people might be dealing with?
Yeah, so I think that the data that we have isn't necessarily about stress. We have more data about burnout. And the burnout figures are incredibly high. So 87% of respondents to our recent workforce wellbeing survey that we carried out with the RPS were found to have a high risk of burnout. Now, 87% is massive.
Huge.
Now, if you consider that burnout is the result of chronic unmanaged stress, that would make me think that means the stress numbers must be higher than the burnout numbers because, you know, burnout comes from chronic unmanaged stress. So I would imagine we're talking about very, very high figures in the profession. We know that there's a lot that can impact people's stress in the profession. We know that there are staffing issues, medicine shortages, and those cause stress for pharmacists in two ways. One is that it's just stressful if you can't get people their medicines and you might be worried about them. You might be worried about the impact on your patients. But then there's also the stress that comes from patients who themselves are stressed at not being able to get their medicines. And sometimes they might take that out on the pharmacist. And we know that there have been cases where people can be abusive, sadly, to pharmacists who don't have the control over this situation, but they're the person kind of on the front line who the patient's interacting with. So that's very stressful. And then, you know, financial pressures, especially maybe for community pharmacy owners, that can be really difficult. Poor work-life balance, long working hours, all of those impact stress.
So, you know, we've just talked about signs of stress. What is the difference between stress and burnout then? Can you give us a bit more of an insight into how we might be able to understand if we're at a point of burnout and how that's different to stress?
Yeah, so I think it's about degree. So stress happens before burnout, if that makes sense. So burnout develops when it's chronic and it's unmanaged. And it's really important to distinguish as well that the WHO defines burnout as occupational stress that has not been managed. So we're talking about it within an occupation. It's not just stress at home or stress in your relationship. So when we talk about burnout, if we're talking about the WHO definition, we're talking about an occupational phenomenon. So we need to be looking at this from the perspective of the workplace. But burnout includes the stress symptoms that we've talked about, but also deeper exhaustion, a difficulty concentrating, could be negativity and cynicism about work. That's often a sign or a symptom of burnout. So someone who's usually quite positive about their work, if they're suddenly cynical and negative, you might be worried about burnout. And also feeling helpless or broken, or like you just can't help the situation. Feeling that hopelessness can be another sign of burnout.
Yeah, and I suppose the danger is sometimes people just say things like, well, it comes with the job. You know, the job is stressful. So why should individuals kind of prioritise reducing and managing stress rather than just saying it comes with the job? Because obviously if it was prolonged, it's going to lead to burnout and difficult, you know, you're going to be in a difficult place. So what do you think about that?
I think everyone should have an interest in managing stress. Employers, employees, if we can all work together to reduce it, you can reduce sickness, you can reduce burnout figures. Clearly, there's an issue in pharmacy that needs attention. On a personal level, stress can disrupt sleep, and when you are underslept, that leads to problems with performance. In a profession such as pharmacy, where accuracy is incredibly important, you don't want to have a population of pharmacists who are not getting adequate sleep, because that can impact job performance. But then there's also mental health problems that can come from unmanaged stress. So depression, anxiety, and then those can have knock-on effects to physical health, blood pressure, heart problems, risk factors for stress, stroke, diabetes. And then just looking at clarity of mind, so ability to see problems objectively and find solutions, that can be impaired when you're under great stress. Having emotional control, having the ability to step back and see a situation or a problem a bit more objectively, that can be really impacted, because when you're really stressed, you are reacting more emotionally. So I think those are the reasons that it's really important to resolve and manage stress.
And I suppose what's quite difficult is because stress is, it's a commonly used word. People, think, I know what stress is and I'll just manage stress, but that's really easy to say. I think sometimes it's harder to do. So what would you say are some top tips really about how we can help to reduce that stress in that work environment?
So the first thing I would say is that workplaces and employees need to work together on this one. I don't think that it's helpful to assume that the employees should just be managing their own stress.
Absolutely.
And that's going to solve the problem, because with burnout being an occupational phenomenon, that means the workplace has a role to play. So if people are being constantly put into situations that are unreasonable or damaging to mental health and well-being, you can't just expect them to sort of learn some meditation techniques or go to counseling to mitigate for that. You need to go to the source, and you need to remove some of those sources of stress. So that's the first thing that I would say, is that workplaces need to take some ownership. So individuals, there are things that they can do, learning breathing techniques, learning some meditation, getting appropriate breaks throughout the day, and then getting advice from the right places. So there can be different factors such as, working conditions, bullying, things that other organizations can help with. So for example, the Pharmacist Defense Association, us, the NPA. There are lots of places out there that can provide support with those issues. And then looking at self-help techniques, and we have a lot of those on our wellbeing learning platform that can help with, for example, using cognitive behavioral skills on yourself, meditation tools, and our wellbeing learning platform has a lot of different workshops that people can take. As a workplace, you could host workshops for the entire pharmacy team so that everyone's talking about it together. And I think that those are really powerful things to do, because then you're talking about stress, you're talking about the issues, and you're trying to find collective ways through it. So if everybody takes a workshop, for example, and thinks, okay, as a workplace, we're going to all commit to taking breaks every day. We're going to make sure that every few hours we take 15 minutes, we get outside, we get some fresh air, we get that light in our eyes, we take a brief walk, and then we'll come back feeling rejuvenated. You can then hold each other accountable and say, have you had your break yet? It's time for you to go. So these are really powerful things that we can do.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point, that it can't be all put on the individual. If the conditions at work are causing the stress, there's only so much you can do as an individual. You can only put so many boundaries in place. If it's just unmanageable, you know, there needs to be that acceptance that it's not just about the individual. And I know, you know, there's been some feedback on the word resilience. Now, really, I feel like building resilience and helping, you know, finding techniques that help you manage your stress are important. But I think people felt like that was putting the ownership on the individual. Well, if you're just a bit more resilient, then everything would be fine. And that's absolutely not what resilience is about. So, you know, we know that employers, and within, you know, within the workplace, your manager, the leaders, play a crucial role then. So what do you think they should be doing, and why should they see this as really important as a priority for them to kind of focus on and prioritise wellbeing and looking at ways they can potentially reduce stress for the people who work there?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I want to pick up on what you said about resilience for a second before we go into what employers should do. And I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about what resilience is. So people think you are a resilient person or you're not, you know, but that's not true. We all have the capacity to be resilient sometimes, and there are times when we're not going to be as resilient. And that can be based on what's happening in our circumstances. So if you're going through a relationship breakdown, a divorce, major financial problems, a child who's having a major issue, these things can sap our ability to cope. They cause a lot of stress. A lot of our resources are going into this one area. And that leaves us potentially less resilient because we don't have as much to draw on to cope with whatever's going on at work. So I'm always very careful when people talk about resilience. I do want people to understand that if someone's not particularly resilient in the workplace, it doesn't mean that they are not a resilient person. It's worth looking at what's the wider picture in their life, in their workplace, and what could be impacting their ability to be resilient in that time. And then you want to deal with those things. So I think that's really important when you're talking about resilience. So moving on to employers and what they can do, I think that employers, managers, and leaders have a huge part to play. And so there are practical things that are important. So fair pay, safe working environment, having enough trained staff, those things are kind of the basics that employers can provide. But then beyond that, it's really worth understanding how managers and leaders can impact on the mental health and well-being of staff. So if you have a manager or a pharmacy leader who is empathetic, who understands what's happening with their staff and tries to work with them to bring out the best in them, who maybe provides extra support and training so that people can meet their potential, that's likely to have a very positive impact on employee well-being. If, on the other hand, you have a manager or leader who is constantly picking up on the little things you're not getting right, who is focusing on those all the time, who's pulling you up all the time, but not providing any support or training to help you improve, but they're constantly kind of bringing you down.
Yeah.
Now that's likely to have quite a negative impact on mental health. And I think a lot of managers, employers, they really want to do the right thing, but they don't have the training. They haven't been taught how to support people. So that's something that we as a charity have noticed, and we created a course to help bridge the gap there called Embracing a Workplace Wellbeing Culture. And that's for pharmacy managers, leaders, or basically anyone who's interested. How do you support others? What are the signs that someone is struggling with their mental health? How do you communicate with people effectively? How do you bring out the best in people and encourage resilience in an organization? So I think all of those are really important things that pharmacy managers and leaders can be doing.
That's great. So, you've touched on MERS. So as Pharmacist Support, we do have that wealth of information for employees and leaders, and the course is, crucial to that, to give people the skills, because, feedback I get is that people want to do the right thing, but you don't always have all the solutions. Everyone's only human. Just in terms of what individuals can do, can you just touch a little bit on some of the support the charity can provide if people are interested in kind of reducing stress and some of the wellbeing resources that we have?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got our counseling service. So if someone was feeling that they are overwhelmed by stress, that it's not being resolved, that it is turning into a chronic situation, they're worried about burnout, our counseling service can definitely be a good resource for people in those situations. We have our peer support service for people who maybe would just like a listening ear from a pharmacist who's been trained to provide support. So we have that. We also have workshops on things like stress management and building resilience. We have a workshop called The Science Behind Wellbeing, which goes into different wellbeing practices, how they work, why they work, how you might implement them into your life. All of those things. We have short videos as well on like breathing practices that can help to reset your nervous system. So if you go to our wellbeing learning platform, you can sign up and see lots of short videos and workshops that individuals can implement. And I think those are really helpful.
And I particularly love the workshops. I mean, I've done them a number of times, sat in on you delivering things, Melissa, and particularly the science behind well-being. I think understanding yourself, like that self-awareness, understanding your triggers, and then understanding some mechanisms you can put in place is really powerful, because it's quite personalised to you. So I think, we all need to go away and just kind of take a step back and go, what are my triggers? What are the signs? What can I do? I think it's so valuable to take that time. I mean, it can seem like you haven't got, you're really stressed, you've got a lot on, haven't got the time to be sitting down doing a workshop on the science behind well-being, but I guarantee it's the best time people can take, because it's so powerful. And I'm saying that from someone who's done it and taken a lot from it. And I think every time I've done it, because I've done it multiple times, I learn something new each time. I take something away. I think about things in a slightly different way. So I just think that's absolutely excellent. And I would urge listeners to go away and have a look what's on our wellbeing learning platform, because there's some great resources. So to wrap up then, drawing on your wealth of wellbeing experience, particularly as a counsellor, what would you say would be the top kind of 3 tips for anyone struggling with workplace stress right at the moment that could maybe have more of an immediate impact and they could see a difference?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is don't be afraid to reach out for help, because that, I think people often don't want to admit that there's a problem, or they might feel something niggling and they think, oh, I might be getting near that point, but I don't have the time. It's much easier to intervene earlier than wait until it's gone, become a more serious issue. So I would say reach out, get some support at an earlier stage.
Yeah.
That would be my first tip. The next tip I would say is take breaks, get outside, get some exercise. Everyone says exercise is good for mental health, but a lot of people don't necessarily understand the mechanisms of why. And some of that is what I talked about earlier with the stress cycle. Just get out and break that stress cycle, discharge some of that that energy, that built up stress reaction. The third thing I would say is learn to do some breathing techniques, because those are things that you can do in the moment when you're starting to feel stressed. Nobody needs to know you're doing them. They're not really obvious. You could just step to the back of the pharmacy, do 4 rounds of box breathing, and then come back. And I think that that's another powerful tool. I think another thing I just wanted to say in terms of employers prioritizing well-being in the workplace, and the idea that there's so many competing pressures, so why should employers really be investing in this? I just think that it's really powerful to realize that Deloitte have done some research on this, and they've found that for every pound spent on supporting the mental health and well-being of the workforce, employers get on average about £4.70 back in increased productivity. So even if you look at it, we should do it. We should, exactly. We should do it because we care.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
If you want to look at it from a business perspective, it's also really helpful for places of work. So I do think there are a lot of reasons to care about well-being and to prioritize it as a workplace as well as an individual.
Absolutely. It's, it sounds like, why would you not do it? Why would you not prioritize it? That's been really great. Thank you so much for helping us understand a little bit more about stress and workplace stress, and what we can do about it, more importantly. I think that's been really great. We always hope our listeners are feeling inspired to bring about positive change in their own lives. If today's podcast has resonated with you, you'll find further information on our website. As Melissa mentioned, we've got lots of information on our wellbeing learning platform, videos, workshops that are freely available to pharmacists, pharmacy students and trainees. For further information on the support services, some of which Melissa mentioned today, such as our counselling service and our listening friends, you can click on the How We Can Help link in the podcast description. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you feel you may need support. As Melissa said, it's often better to reach out earlier than leave it, so please do reach out. And we want to continue as a charity providing this free and confidential support and these services, and also open up conversations like this so no one in our pharmacy family faces these challenging times on their own. We are an independent charity, and we do rely on donations from individuals and organisations to help us deliver what we do. So if you are in a position, please consider donating to us. You'll find a QR code in the show's description at the end of the video and at the end of the video. Donations are really essential to help us deliver what we do, particularly our services. So any help you can give is really appreciated. So thank you for listening, and we do look forward to seeing you again at our next podcast.